The CGLCC, and welcome to the 2020 Digital LGBT Plus Global Business Summit. Before we get started on the session, CGLCC would like to recognise our presenting sponsor, TD Bank Group, along with all of our gold and silver sponsors and all of our sponsors for helping us to make this event happen. We would also like to recognise our translation partner, AI Media, for enabling us to deliver live caption translation in 3 languages, English, French and Spanish, and you can access those using the links below in the description box. I'd also like to draw your attention to the left-hand side of your screen to the networking and exhibit hall tabs, where over the course of the next 5 days you can connect with LGBT plus businesses, corporations and each other to help drive that power of connection. And finally, if you do like the content we are producing, please feel free to make a financial contribution using the donate link in the description box below. Thank you and enjoy your session.
Hi everyone, welcome to a conversation about race and racism. My name is Annemarie Schrouder. I want to start by acknowledging the land that we're on, that for thousands of years Indigenous people all over the world have cared for, lived on, walked on, and continue to do so, this land. And as a Canadian, my contribution to reconciliation is to be aware of my status as a settler, to acknowledge the presence of Indigenous peoples, and to do my part in creating that bridge so that we can better connect, better understand, and rectify some of the oppressions of the last hundreds of years. Have to say that it's very strange to be on this call with you and not see anybody. So I feel like I'm talking to myself, but I want to welcome you. I do diversity and inclusion work in Toronto. I'm passionate about this work. I think it's critical that we deepen our conversation. And so given the current global events that were begun in the USA a few weeks ago with the murder of George Floyd at the hands of police, what I've seen in the last few weeks are different leaning into conversations around race, anti-racism and anti-Black racism, which as someone who has done this work for over 16 years, really heartens me to see that leaning in, to see that willingness. So I have greater hope than I had a few weeks ago that things are moving in a direction where there will actually be some meaningful change. So what I wanted to do for today is provide you with the opportunity to have a conversation, time to ask questions that maybe are on your heart, on your mind, personally or as a leader in your organization of various kinds, no matter where you are in the world, and to facilitate that conversation so that we can start that deeper awareness and that deeper understanding. How we'll do that today is through the chat. So you'll see on your screen, I'm sure you've done it before in this forum for the last few days, there's a chat option, and if you type your question into the chat, then I will answer that question. If you want to sort of converse back and forth while I'm doing that, then again, use the chat feature. And Niall is going to help me with that. Thanks, Niall. And we'll get started. We'll get started now. A couple of things I want to just put out there in terms of guidelines. We can't see each other and we can't interrupt each other. So I don't really need to talk about space, but I'm encouraging you to be curious. I'm encouraging you to be curious about what you're hearing from other people. The information that I'm going to share with you, of course, otherwise you wouldn't have joined. But also to be curious what's happening in the back of your mind. What's the conversation or the monologue that's happening, that little voice that natters on and on at us about various things throughout the day. That's where stereotypes live, prejudice lives, assumptions live, bias live, and when we become aware of that, we have the opportunity to step into response or conversation or reaction in a different, more conscious way. And so I would encourage you to pay attention to that little voice. The other thing I want to encourage you to do is listen, not just to what people are saying, but the bigger context of what they're bringing to their questions. Of course, you're not going to hear them talking today, but the questions that are coming up. Confidentiality. Again, I'll be seeing the questions, and so you won't be hearing them or seeing who they're from. So that's not as much of an issue, but if you happen to guess who's speaking or know who might be speaking, then I just ask you to take the learning with you from today and let the stories, the personal stories connected to people, stay here. And the last one is self-care. Depending on your social location, depending on your skin color, your geography, what's going on for you, other experiences that you've had, this conversation might, you might need to take a little break. So I encourage you to do that and come back and join us when you're ready. So I'm going to check my Q&A mode to see if there's anything happening yet. And otherwise, I will hop into some of my tips and tools that you can use to create safer spaces, to be able to have these conversations. And that, again, it's cyclical. These conversations also help us to create safety or a safer space for our colleagues, for our employees, in our organizations, in our communities, in our lives. So I'm just going to take a moment to be quiet and see if any questions pop up. And then we'll see what happens. No, oh, here we go. Thank you. We have one already. Yay, I was going to say people are quiet today. So the question is, I struggle when people tell me that I don't look, and it's in quotation marks, Hispanic or gay. I can see they don't mean to offend me. I don't know how to address this in the best way possible. It's a great question right off the bat. Thank you for sharing. And I'm not going to share people's names, just to add a layer of anonymity, another layer of anonymity. That's an example of a microaggression, right? Microaggressions are brief and common daily verbal behavior or environmental comments intended to, unintentional or intentional, that may feel to the person saying them, delivering them, that they're compliments, but actually underneath that there's a bit of a something, and that something is related to bias, is related to stereotypes, is related to assumptions and prejudice, and they're directed at non-dominant groups. So the fact that you are Hispanic makes you a non-dominant group for, skin color, culture. The fact that you identify as gay makes you a non-dominant group for sexual orientation. And so microaggressions, they don't hurt a little bit. I'm not sure why they chose the word microaggressions, but they really do impact the people that receive them. And because they are often unintentional, because we don't always have an awareness of the undercurrent that's happening that informs how we see people. Really, when you think about it, if somebody tells you you don't look Hispanic or gay, what are they saying? So I want you to all think about that for a moment, because it's quite possible that at one time or another, many of us have said something like that with the intention of it being a compliment. But what is it saying if you're telling somebody they don't look fill in the blank? It says that there's a stereotype or a judgment that you have about how they should look, and often the fact that you're saying it's a compliment means that whatever that is isn't positive, isn't valued. So the question is, I see they don't mean to offend, but I don't know how to address this in the best way possible. So I'll make it personal and say that I've had the opportunity to be on the receiving end of that, in terms of you don't look black, and I'm biracial, so that there's a whole other layer of that. But sometimes the best way to answer, to respond to questions like this, is with a question. Give the person the opportunity to think a little bit about what they said. What do you mean? Simple as that. We are not necessarily going to change somebody's mind, right? We have very ingrained ways of seeing the world and thinking. We have opportunities to provide some breadcrumbs or some, like a drip method to help them become more and more aware. So if you ask, what do you mean? It can be a very awkward moment, but it gives that person an opportunity to think a little bit about what they've said, what they've asked you. So that would be my recommendation. Depending on how well you know them, you may want to explain, when you say that, I don't really know how to respond, because it's devaluing a little bit of who I am, or however it's landing for you. If you have a relationship that you can have that conversation, then I would encourage you and not just the person who asked the question, but anybody who's in a situation like this, to maybe lean in a little bit to that conversation and let them know vulnerably how you're feeling about that. But again, that depends on your relationship. It also depends on the hierarchy. If it's in the office and it's somebody who you report to, you may be less willing to do that. So those are my 2 suggestions. I may come up with other ones as we continue the conversation, but hopefully that's helpful for now. Someone is asking me to discuss the concept of proximity. So I think I need you to say a little bit more about that, please, so I can get a real sense of what you mean. So let's see if we can, oh. Nayel, I'm seeing a question here, but it's covered with blue, so I can't actually read it. Is that on purpose? Sorry, folks. Technical issues. Okay, so so whoever asked the question about proximity, if you have a moment to just type a little bit more into the chat, that would be great. Let me see if I can read this one. Whoops. I own a small business with extensive reach with gay men, primarily white and 40 plus around North America. As a business, we have been on a mission over the past year to be more inclusive of race, body type, and age, and we want to take a stand on the current issue of racism. The current issue is anti-Black racism specifically, and that's a very important, shouldn't be wagging my finger, a very important distinction, yeah? Anti-Black racism is specific to the Black community, which is what we've been seeing, and the response to specifically anti-Black racism, and it's an important distinction because anti-Black racism also happens in communities of color. So it's a very specific terminology. We are not afraid to ruffle feathers with our current base. However, we are very nervous about backlash from IPOC, Indigenous people of color. I believe we need to acknowledge our past failures, set goals for the future, but most importantly, take a stand against racism and indicate that we are here to listen and learn. Yes. Do you have recommendations above and beyond this to ensure we aren't viewed as opportunistic due to timing, but also supportive of the movement? That's a fantastic question. Thank you for asking that question. I've had a few opportunities this week to chat with organizations about statements they want to make. I'm talking with the board of directors later on today about, what happens next. And so what I would say to you is outward facing, in your marketing, all of that stuff, your communication, that's an amazing signal to folks that you are or want to be more inclusive, that you're supportive. In this current situation around anti-Black racism, there's been a lot of statements made by a lot of organizations. Some of them are amazing, some of them less so. So that specific language is really important in this particular current climate and situation, if that's what you're responding to. But really, to ensure that you're not viewed as opportunistic, it's about what you're doing internally in your organization, not outward facing, right? So if you have employees, how is the environment for them? Have you had conversations with them? Are you supporting your employees of color, Black employees, African American, LGBTQ2SI employees, all the different layers of diversity? How are you showing that commitment internally? The places that people outside don't see, that your clients and customers don't see. I believe that that's where this work needs to start, because we want to create an environment where everybody can feel comfortable and have a sense of belonging so that they can show up at work and contribute fully. The benefits that we often associate with diversity are really the benefits of inclusion. So if we don't have a diverse and inclusive space, we can have all the diversity we want, and there's going to be less collaboration, there's going to be less input, it's going to not change what we're doing or how we're doing it. So that's what I would recommend, that you take a look inside and see what your policies look like, what your processes look like, procedures. What kind of conversations have you had with staff? What kind of conversations can you have with staff? For example, have you had a town hall or a discussion with staff in the last few weeks to see how they're feeling. Staff who are Black, staff who are people of color, staff who are white. That would be a first step. Just to give them the space to speak. And we do that in this particular current situation. And when we start to open these conversations in general, I recommend that we do that in very specific groupings. So people who are white, people who are of color, people who are Black, depending on your numbers, right? And depending on how safe your space is, because we want to give people the forum and the space to share, to ask questions that's safe. And sometimes we can't do that in mixed groups right away. People who are Black, people who are African American are going to be traumatized and needing space to grieve together and support each other. And people who are of color may also be feeling the same. Maybe one layer removed, maybe not. People who are white and who want to be allies or who are just leaning into anti-Black racism, what is it? Need a space to ask questions and share. And right now, it's best to do those separately. Nael, I'm losing my questions here. Okay, we need to be careful with language, especially in business, with the jargon we use on a daily basis. I've had to call out people for using the term powwow when they describe an informal meeting. People need to be more aware. Absolutely. Language is critical to creating safer space, right? As folks in LGBTQ2SI communities, we know the importance of gender neutral language and what that does for us in allowing us to step into a space more fully and allowing us to be more present. That type of awareness of language is equally important across the board, and Dale has provided us with a really good example. So the challenge is that we often don't realize that the language we're using is derogatory or could be offensive, or it's culturally appropriating. So there's an education piece that we need to do. Yeah? And this work around diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, all of this work, and then the antis, any anti-ism, requires a personal commitment to growth and understanding and knowledge. And so there's resources that we can avail ourselves of, books and videos and Netflix specials now that can help us to engage our own learning and understanding. Another question. Thank you for all the questions. Ooh, there's lots. Okay. I'm a 60-year-old woman and Hispanic. I feel young, but I'm surprised that jobs in the Hispanic world are only for young people, less than 40 years old. This is a double discrimination. Absolutely. Yeah. And, you know, in many cultures, the older you are, the wiser you are, and the more respect you get. And in some cultures, it's not the case, right? It's the exact opposite. North American culture is one of those. So absolutely, it's a double discrimination, and it's painful, right? We're not just one thing, and those of us with more than one marginalized identity are going to feel the impact of discrimination, of inequity, of lack of inclusion, lack of awareness, more, right? It's gonna hit us stronger. Another question. I'm a school board trustee. Earlier this week, we discussed canceling the police liaison program to address instances of racism and homophobia from police officers in our school. The motion failed. When I speak to my colleagues, most of whom are white, they have a hard time understanding the perspectives of marginalized communities. For example, newcomer, Black, Indigenous, LGBTQ2+. They want to see data and recorded instances of racism in schools to make evidence-based decisions. A lot of that data doesn't exist. The BLM movement has helped amplify the voices of youth who don't want police in schools. How can I teach or explain the concept of white privilege to those in power? That's a question we could talk about for like the whole hour. So at the end of the session, I will give you well, maybe you have it already. It's probably in the description. So feel free to hop on there and send me an email, and we can chat further. But teaching or explaining the concept of white privilege to those in power is extremely challenging, evidenced by the fact that we've experienced anti-Black racism, and other forms of oppression for hundreds of years, specific around anti-Black racism, hundreds of years. We've been talking about it, we've been making noise about it, we've had movements, and something about this one is different. I believe, and many people I've chatted with believe, it's because we have a video that actually shows what happened, not a they said versus they said. And the reason we've had 400 plus years of trying to make people aware is because privilege and for people in power is not something that we see, right? Privilege means that we have access and we navigate the world with relative ease because the systems and structures are made with us in mind. And we can have white privilege, we can have straight privilege, we can have cisgender privilege, male privilege. All the dominant identities have privilege. And it means that the systems and structures are made with them in mind so they can navigate the day and through their life more easily. Doors open in a different way or more or at all. They have a different access to networks. And so how do we teach or explain the concept of white privilege? I do that, explaining the concept of privilege through activities so that people are engaging not just their head, but their heart. And they can experience a little bit of what that's like. The way that I've done that in the past has been through ability. Because if everybody in the room is able-bodied, it can be a very tangible way to show the difference when you have access, when you don't. The challenge with other isms that are not that don't involve physical barriers is that they're harder to experience vicariously and therefore harder to prove, which again goes back to we've been having these conversations in communities, in marginalized communities for decades and hundreds of years. And now people are starting to listen. So it's teaching privilege, teaching the concept of white privilege, again, I think has to engage people's hearts. So if you can find an activity, there's an activity called Cross the Line that if you Google, you'll be able to find videos about it. And you can attempt to replicate. That's one of the powerful ways that we create change is through emotion. Yeah. So it's not an intellectual conversation by itself. Okay, got that one. Sometimes I've seen well-meaning diversity initiatives, in quotation marks, by a business/office/employer that have no legacy program for further career growth or mentorship. And this can reinforce bias or institutional tokenism. The question is, what homework or outreach should an organization or business do before they attempt to begin this process? I'm assuming that's the process of the diversity initiative. Well, first of all, the fact that it's an initiative is a problem, right? Diversity and inclusion is not an initiative, it's a way of being that ideally will permeate everywhere in your organization into the DNA of your organization. And so the problem is that often organizations see it as an initiative, see it as the right thing to do today, and not the right thing to do in capital letters underlined. And so we begin with a workshop and it stays with a workshop. And what that does is it raises expectations, raises hopes, starts conversations that then have nowhere to go. So that's problematic. And so what we need to do is make sure that we are aware of what it actually means to create an environment that's both diverse and inclusive. It's important. Both of those things are important. We want more representation from marginalized groups, from communities that we represent as a business, absolutely. And we need to start with inclusion, because if we start with diversity by conscious hiring, et cetera, and the environment isn't safe, isn't inclusive, isn't equitable, then the people that we've invited in will have a negative experience and we'll see issues like lack of engagement, lack of productivity, absenteeism, and high turnover, which defeats the purpose. So you want to start with the inclusion piece. So that's one of the recommendations I would say. Before you attempt to begin this process, you want to have a conversation and see if you get what you are asking yourselves to do. Understand the fullness of what it means to create an organization that values diversity and inclusion and move yourself forward. And so you're right, just as this person has mentioned here, career growth, mentorship, that's important. We don't just want to get people in the door. What we also see is lack of representation in leadership. So sometimes organizations have lack of representation, period. But then often organizations have high representation at entry level, and the higher up you go on the ladder, the less representation there is. So mentorship is important. Sponsorship is important. And there's an important distinction to make between mentorship and sponsorship. Sponsorship is where you actually advocate for, on behalf of, put people's names forward, be the network that often historically disadvantaged groups don't have. because of their historical disadvantage. Yeah. Next question. Uh-oh. Nael, I know you're there and you're checking, but I feel like I've missed something further up. The next question is, I've seen on social media a lot of white folks asking their QT BIPOC peers to educate them on how they can be better allies. How can we better educate these folks, and is it our job to do so? I need to sit back for that one. That's a really good question. So I have to start the answer to that question with a bit of a personal story or entry point. So as somebody who's biracial, and I try not to use that word anymore, but it's one word rather than a whole explanation of my background. But as a person who's biracial, I have personally experienced in my body the polarization that we are seeing out in the world. Either or, white, black, us, them, you, me, gay, straight, whatever the identity is. Right now we're seeing a lot of the polarization around white and black. And the challenge that I have with this work is that if we stay in that either or, I believe that we're not going to get very far, because we have a me versus you, we're separate type of mentality. So what I'd like to suggest to you all on the call is that the space that I'm moving into, that I welcome you into, is a both and space, which if I hold my hands up like that, it's like a cup, it's like a holding, right? We can be both and. So I have half of my family is black and from the Caribbean and various other parts of the world, and half of my family is white. So for me, that both and is not having to choose one or the other, but resting in the middle where I can say I am black and white and both, right? Just like we do around the new conversations that we've been having around gender. So I think that we all have to step into the conversation about anti-Black racism, around racism. We all participate in that conversation. We participate differently. And it's important to recognize that for Black individuals, African Americans, for Indigenous individuals, for people of color, these are conversations that we've had for a very, 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 very long time, have been trying to raise awareness about for a very, 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 very long time. And when you consider the lived reality of someone of color, of somebody Black, of somebody who's Indigenous, those daily microaggressions, the unconscious bias, the prejudice, the discrimination, the barriers that we bump up against every single day is exhausting. So you may see, especially now because there's so much heightened awareness about it, that folks who don't have a lived experience as a person of color or as somebody Black or Indigenous, there's a wanting to know, right? So they want to know, they want to be educated. And there's often an exhaustion, I can't have this conversation right now response from folks of color, from folks who are Black, from folks who are Indigenous. And we could say the same for any marginalized group, right? Today we happen to be focusing on race and racism. So in that both and conversation, there's room for both perspectives, both communities, all communities to come together and move this forward. How can we better educate? How can we better educate folks who want to be allies? Is by taking the time to share our stories and to answering questions. And is it our job to do so? Yes and no. And that might not be a popular sentiment with everybody. I think we need to be willing to move into conversations to help folks understand. I think folks who are non-BIPOC need to understand the incredible emotional labor that it takes to have those conversations. And if you're one of a few people of color, Black or Indigenous people in that person's circle, you might be tapped on by a lot of people. That's exhausting. So I think folks who want to be allies have to take it on themselves to educate themselves, look for credible sources of information, of course, right? Ask if there's a willingness to enter into a conversation. Don't assume that there's a willingness to enter into conversation. And I think on the other side, those of us in BIPOC communities also need to be willing to, say, I can't talk about it right now. for whatever reason, right? I just can't. Can we maybe another time, or I'll let you know when I have the energy to have the conversation. Thank you for asking. And in the meantime, you may have some resources that you know of that you can share, right? So we're not saying it's your problem, you deal with it, come back when you know, because that's not helpful. We exercise some self-care, absolutely necessary, relevant, and then participate in some way in facilitating those conversations. I had something else I wanted to say and I forgot what it is, but maybe it'll come back. I think there. I'm back. Hi, everyone. Okay, so many of the agencies and organization representatives we need for their network on our committee are led by largely white settler folks, seemingly because those organizations have not formed inclusive organizations themselves. So if I'm understanding, there's not a lot of representation in those organizations, so the folks that you're getting on your advisory task force are not Black, Indigenous, people of color, or queer, or trans. We are still committed to representation on the committee and are doing our best to find committee members among partner organizations who are QT BIPOC, but we are now also considering other ways to centralize non-white voices, as this seems to be a very difficult recruitment problem to overcome in the seniors care sector. What are your thoughts on ways to do this additional BIPOC advisories or seated committee reps? Okay, so if I'm reading the question properly, I feel like you're asking how to overcome the lack of representation, and the organizations that you would go to find your reps in terms of seniors care aren't representative, so that your regular go-to places are not available. So this is where, you know, and this happens in companies, it happens in boards, this is not an isolated incident. We hang out with people like us as human beings, right? Comfortable. And so when we're recruiting, when we are looking to add people to a committee, we're going to go to the people we know. And those people, because they largely look like us, are going to reflect the people that are already sitting around the table. So what I suggest that you do is find other places you haven't tapped into within the communities you're missing. And the challenge here is, in all types of recruitment, that we're not always looking at the usual suspects. We can't go into a different, we can't diversify our recruitment or make our recruitment more inclusive wearing the same hat we've always worn when we do recruitment, or in this case, yeah, looking even for committee members. So what you want to do is think outside the box. So I would recommend you start by chatting with folks that you know that aren't part of your committee, but that are a part of the communities you're looking to represent, and ask them, you know, how you could reach out to people, where you could reach out to people, where do these seniors, if people are interested in seniors care, where are they hanging out? And what's the best way to approach a conversation about, this is what we're looking for, this is what we need, would you be interested, right? Because sometimes the tactics we use for recruitment also don't work. So that's what I would recommend as a first step. Ooh, now I get to see all the questions. Let me see if I'm missing any. I didn't get a further explanation about proximity. So if you're still there, if you've asked the question, I'd love to be able to answer it. What is your definition of POC? I've experienced white folks with Asian background referring themselves as POC, and I'm confused about how to react to this statement. It's a good question. Okay, so people of color. As with any label, there's the label, and then there's how people identify. So I identify as a person of color. I could be identified by somebody else as Black, as a person of color, as whatever. So we need to be careful with definitions, because people get to determine how they want to identify, and sometimes that's going to impact what we think it is, right? So somebody who is white folks with Asian background referring to themselves as POC, for example, if that's how they feel, if they don't feel like they're part of white community because of their Asian background, because they've had experiences with discrimination, etc., then that might be confusing to you, but it clearly makes sense to them. And so sometimes I've seen people of color being used broadly for anybody who's not white-skinned. And sometimes that's cultural, because Asian people can be very light-skinned, but they still experience discrimination based on culture, right? So I think for some, and I'm just guessing because I don't know who this person, I don't know who they are, I'm guessing that might be a way for them to find a sense of community, right? If they don't just want to identify as Asian, but in a group that experiences similar bias and discrimination that they do. So proximity, trying to understand better based on some recent podcasts with Austin Channing Brown, I believe, as it relates to relationships with BIPOC. I saw Austin Channing Brown this morning, brief snippet on LinkedIn, interviewed by Brene Brown. So if you follow Brene on LinkedIn, you might want to check out that conversation. I just had time to listen to the 2-minute, and the 2 minutes were fantastic, but it's a much longer clip. So I believe that what this is referring to, the proximity in terms of relationships with people who are Black, Indigenous, or people of color, are things like you're married to somebody who's Black, Indigenous, or a person of color, but you're not, you're white. Or you have children who are Black and, identify as Black, Indigenous, or people of color because your partner is, and they are mixed, or whatever language we want to use, biracial. There's lots of words that are used for children of mixed heritage. And what tends to happen is, now I'm not sure if this is what Austin Channing Brown is saying, so I'm just going to answer the question from my perspective. But what often tends to happen is, because we have that proximity, right? So my mom would be one example. My mom is white-skinned and my dad is dark-skinned. People may come up to mom and say, wow, your partner is Black, help us understand, tell us more. Rather than going to, and again, we're talking about allies and not always tapping the shoulders of people in marginalized groups to help us understand. So in some ways, I think tapping the shoulders of people who are in proximity to people of color, partners, spouses, parents, in some cases, maybe children, depending on, right? Genes are funny things. You could have parents of two different races and be very, very, very light-skinned and not be identified as a person of color, and not even identify yourself as a person of color. So it's very, very complicated. When we start getting into the deeper conversation, we could spend hours just unpacking that. But so I think there's a tendency to, instead of chatting with the source, right, getting a lived experience, we want to go to the person sort of next to, close enough, but not quite. And sometimes that can be helpful in terms of perspective. But remember, if you're talking to somebody who's in proximity to, you're not going to get the same perspective as if you're talking to somebody who is. Yeah. And that reminds me what I wanted to say earlier with the allyship conversation. Lived experiences, sharing lived experiences is powerful. So another way to address white privilege might be, or any kind of privilege, might be to have the opportunity for people to hear from somebody with lived experience about the impact, right? Maybe that organization does particular work and there's somebody that can speak to that particular work that they do or programs that they provide. Now, again, we have to be careful about the emotional labor we're asking Black, Indigenous, and people of color to do in this case, right? So while personal stories are impactful, we also have to be very, very conscious of that. What else have we got for questions? What are your recommendations for self-learning from credible sources? Oh, I'm so glad you asked that. I have a growing list of resources. I also at the end will share a link with you if you want to. I just have put together a short document called Creating Safer Spaces, just about leaning into difficult conversations, the importance of creating safety, and some of the things to keep in mind for that. So I'll share that link with you at the end if you want to sign up to receive that. And there are some resources specifically about anti-Black racism in the back of that document. And in fact, what you're helping me to remember is that I probably have to update that list. My list is growing. So that's one recommendation. Credible sources, I would suggest that, you look for sources in the communities that you're trying to learn about. Organizations that work in communities, organizations that have a social justice, anti-oppression, anti-racism focus. Folks like me who do this work, often there's a resource page on websites, right? We want to be careful of where we're getting our resources, because remember, anti-Black racism and all isms are systemic. And the systemic nature of that means that we can get a skewed perspective on how to address the ism, right? So we want to make sure, and so I appreciate the word credible, self-learning from credible sources. I know that there's a workbook that I've come across recently, haven't dived into yet, called Me and White Supremacy. So that's one, I've heard really good things about it. It's a 21-day challenge of some kind, and you questions and you have time to reflect. So that's something that you might want to check out, and that's listed in the back of the resource that I'm going to share with you. We're almost out of time, so although I've been told that we can stay till 4, so if I look and see that people are still around, I'll just keep chatting. But maybe, Nayal, you're there. Maybe can you put the link to the resource, the Creating Safer Spaces resource, into the chat for folks? Now I'll get to see if he's actually there and he's listening.
That information.
Thank you. So there'll be a link if you want to sign up to get the Creating Safer Spaces document. There's resources in there. And the other option that's going to come up in a minute in the chat is to sign up for my newsletter. So I do a weekly inclusion insight meant to keep diversity and inclusion on your radar. And I talk about all types of diversity. Right now I'm focusing specifically on race. But it's short. It links to a longer blog if you want to read more. And there's always a challenge in there, because we have to practice awareness, right? It's not just about talking about it and reading about it. Then we have to put it into action. So what are you doing every day to build that muscle of awareness? Okay, so we are grown, another question, we are grown to be polar. I'm thinking polarized. Black and white, good and bad, straight and gay, and so on. What is your advice so we change and integrate a polar world into an integrated world where everybody is needed? Yeah, it's a big question for like the last 2 minutes of the call. I can only tell you that the journey that I've gone through to get to that place has been long. In my own awareness of who I am, in acknowledging all of who I am, in accepting all of who I am, that's been long. I think as LGBTQ2SI plus community members, we could probably relate to that from that identity as well, like the questioning, the coming out, the acceptance. So for me, it's all about building community and connection, and it's so lovely that the summit is called The Power of Connection. I don't think that we have enough opportunities to connect, period, but connect across difference particularly, right? Whether it's racial difference, whether it's sexual orientation difference, those opportunities are crucial. And so a big part of the work I do in organizations is creating that sense of community so we can get to know each other, so that we have a raised level of awareness, so that we can create cultures of learning and recognize our common humanity. That's so critical to this work. And that might sound easy. It's not easy, but it's fundamental, right? And to get back to where we started around the conversation of specifically anti-Black racism, anti-Black racism exists systemically because a few hundred years ago, somebody decided that there were races and divided us up by skin color and characteristics and perpetuated that myth for the purpose of supporting the Atlantic slave trade. And that myth has flowed into the narrative, the human narrative, that there are different races of people. There aren't. There's one race, the human race. We have different skin colors and different characteristics, but there's one race. And so we need to get back to that commonality, that humanity. And I think the way to do that is to build community and to have more opportunities to connect across difference. Which reminds me that I'm working on another project called Around the Fire, where we'll have an opportunity to do that online. Just, recognize biases and see where our assumptions lie in the hopes of connecting with one or two other people, just to break those down and see really what we could be missing, what we are missing when we keep ourselves separate in the either or, us and them. Do I still have people here with me? I do. So one other question, especially within the arts from Indigenous input, it has been repeated that gatekeepers need to decolonize and dismantle their ideas of expertise and qualified when looking for greater representation or inclusion. How can this idea carry over to the business world? That's a fantastic idea. And in fact, this morning I was doing a facilitated discussion, a sharing circle, actually, we called it, with a client. And somebody in that session said, we need more representation in this organization. And just because you have a certain qualification doesn't mean you're going to do the job the best. And so I'm not suggesting we change our requirements, but what that suggested to me and reminded everybody in the group about was the ways that we see expertise and qualifications through a very, very narrow lens, usually our own. Right? Did I go to this? What school did you go to? Did you go to school? What degree did you get? Sometimes we look at grades depending on the profession. So how do we take this idea of expertise and qualified and decolonize it? Well, what are some other ways that we show expertise? Do we have lived experience? Have we volunteered? Right? When we look at a resume, it needs to be a more expansive look. And so getting clear on what we are looking for a position, what the skill set is, not necessarily how that skill set comes to be, right? What do we want to know about in the interview? How do we want people what kind of information are we looking for? Not how do we want to get that information? Those are some of the questions that we need to ask ourselves. And of course, when we're doing a hiring panel, if that panel can be diverse and more representative, and we can have real and deeper conversations about bias, about the barriers that we're bumping up against. I've been in hiring committees where we've actually had conversations about, I have a bias towards or against X. And so that's going to show up for me. So just so you know, you can ask me some more questions and help me to snap out of it if I haven't been able to do that for myself. By putting those biases on the table, by putting the barriers that we have around, certain how people look or the school they went to or the extracurricular activities they do or don't do or the networks that they run in, being able to have conversations about that can help us to get beyond those, can mitigate those. So hopefully that's helpful. Durham Region is doing something in your community. Something like a roundtable. I see the link. I'm going to check it out. I do have an engagement from 6:30 to 8, so we'll see. Can I share the link for Around the Fire? No, because it's not live yet. But if you sign up for my newsletter, which is in the chat, when it goes live, which I'm hoping will be in a week or two, it'll be in there. So sign up for the newsletter, and then you'll be among the first to know when it goes live. I'm really, really excited about it. I'm really looking forward to the opportunity to do what I do in workshops with a broader audience. Favorite quotes from Sally Hogg said, "Different is better than better." Different is better than better. Nice. That's a good quote. Yeah, there's a lot of good quotes circling around. So I'm just looking to see if there's any other questions. Glad you enjoyed the conversation. Thank you. Just looking through to see if I've missed anything. Contact information to follow up on the white privilege discussion. Okay, I'm going to put my email into the chat. It's Annemarie at annemarieshrouder.com. Okay, happy to connect with folks over email. Listening circles of inclusion, respectful, open, honest, healthy, and sometimes uncomfortable conversations about racism, addressing discriminatory practices, policies, beliefs, and attitudes within ourselves and within our Durham region community and surrounding communities. Wow, that's amazing. Okay, so if you like that, Listening Circles of Inclusion, there's one happening tonight, and the link is in the chat. Thank you. Thanks, Sue. It's fabulous. I think just to close, and I'm happy to stay on till 4 if people are there and you want to keep talking. But I think to close, and what you'll see more discussion on in the resource if you sign up to receive it, are, we, especially as leaders, we need to lead into these conversations, into difficult conversations, into challenging conversations. And some of the ways that I'd like you to keep in mind to do that is showing up, being willing to have that conversation, saying that you're willing to have that conversation. That's a huge first step for folks, because folks in marginalized communities are either tired of asking and having no response, scared to ask, hesitant to ask. So if somebody in a position of leadership, somebody who's an ally, who's not Black, Indigenous, or a person of color, steps up and says, we need to have these conversations, that's a huge first step. So that's important. I encourage you to start where you are. If you're uncomfortable, start with the uncomfortable. If you're nervous, start with the nervous. It's okay. We're all human beings. We all know what those feel like. And leaning into difficult conversations is challenging, particularly around race and racism, because these are conversations we haven't had often, right? If we're not Black, Indigenous, or people of color. So by starting where you are, by acknowledging your discomfort, it allows us to step into the conversation as human beings, right? You don't have to pretend that everything's okay or that you get it. If you really want to know, you really want to start the conversation, I would encourage you to do that. Emotions are important. Whatever you're feeling is part of your humanity and helps us to connect. Now we have to be careful about, as allies, taking up emotional space, right? It's not the person of color, the Black person, it's the Indigenous person in this case, job to comfort you and help you feel better or feel less, I've heard things like guilt and shame. That's not our job. That's your emotion. So it's okay to have it and it's okay to share it, but sometimes those emotions sort of spill over into the whole conversation. The conversation becomes about taking care of the person who's having that response. That's not part of the marginalized community. And that's another example of privilege where the attention might switch to that person, and then the conversation we meant to have has ended. And once again, the person from the marginalized communities, the people, whether they be Black, Indigenous, people of color, other marginalized identities, the forum that we had created to have a conversation about their lived experience has now been removed. Discomfort is okay. It's okay to be uncomfortable. You are going to be uncomfortable if this is not a conversation that you're used to having. So be okay with that. It may be uncomfortable for a while, and that's okay. Being vulnerable is important. Be as vulnerable as you can be to step into the space, because it helps us to connect as human beings. Ask questions, and again, as mentioned before, how we ask, who we're asking often. Be very aware of the emotional labor that's taking place, that you're asking someone else to do. And the last one is listening. The first thing that I'm recommending people do in this current climate and situation is listen. Create spaces for people to listen to each other. And like I said, around race and racism, those conversations, unless you've already created a safe space to have mixed conversations, those conversations I would recommend start in intact groups, white, skinned, people of color, people who are Black, so that people can just be where they are and share and ask, or share and support, or be in pain together, whatever needs to happen. Listening is a big piece of that. And listening is a piece that, all of these are for beginning, but also through the entire process. You want to start with where you are. You want to be okay and acknowledge emotion. You want to learn to be okay with discomfort. You want to be vulnerable, ask questions, and listen. This is how we get out of the polarization, either or, into the both and, because we're connecting as human beings. And I believe that when we connect more as human beings, we will move forward in our conversation around anti-Black racism and racism, in our conversation around inequities, in a way that is powerful, healing, and provides the opportunity to see a new way of being together that we create together. So I want to thank you all for being here with me today, for being willing to enter into the conversation about race and racism. I'm wishing you all courage and fortitude to have those conversations regardless of your identities. They're important conversations to have right now. I think we're at a time in history that I hope we will look back and see that it was a tipping point for real change. Yeah. So again, if you'd like to sign up for my newsletter, there's a link. If you'd like to sign up for the Creating Safer Spaces document, there's also a link. I've left you my email address if you want to have a deeper discussion. I encourage you to all look at what you can do personally and organizationally in real, meaningful ways to move the conversations forward, to move your commitments forward, so that everyone can show up, participate, be seen, heard, and valued. And we all participate in making the world a better place that way. Thank you so much. I'm going to sign off now. I'm wishing you a good end to the summit. And I look forward to seeing you via my newsletter send outs. Thank you. Have a wonderful day, everyone.